Modern poetry. Characteristics of modern poetry. Trends and movements in modern poetry. Modernism, a broadly defined multinational cultural movement, or series of movements, that took hold in the late 19th century and reached its most radical peak on the eve of World War I. It grew out of the philosophical, scientific, political, and ideological shifts that followed the Industrial Revolution, up to World War I and its aftermath. For artists and writers, the Modernist project was a re-evaluation of the assumptions and aesthetic values of their predecessors. It evolved from the Romantic rejection of Enlightenment positivism and faith in reason. Modernist writers broke with Romantic pieties and clichés, such as the notion of the Sublime, and became self-consciously skeptical of language and its claims on coherence. In the early 20th century, novelists such as Henry James, Virginia Woolf, and Joseph Conrad experimented with shifts in time and narrative points of view. While living in Paris before the war, Gertrude Stein explored the possibilities of creating literary works that broke with conventional syntactical and referential practices. Ezra Pound vowed to make it new and break the pentameter, while T.S. Eliot wrote The Waste Land in the shadow of World War I. Shortly after The Waste Land was published in 1922, it became the archetypical modernist text, rife with allusions, linguistic fragments, and mixed registers and languages. Other poets most often associated with modernism include H.D., W. H. Auden, Hart Crane, William Butler Yeats, and Wallace Stevens. Modernism also generated many smaller movements. Also see Acmism, Dada, Free Verse, Futurism, Imagism, Objectivism, Postmodernism, and Surrealism. Modern poetry spans from 1900 to the end of World War I. Around 1918 some changes occurred thanks to the first-generation modernists, especially Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. The influence of war poetry. Ezra Pound, an American poet and critic, contributed to modernist poetry through to literary and artistic movements that were greatly influential. Imagism, Vorticism. To keep it simple, we can define Imagism as an artistic movement which aimed at writing poetry in a new way by fixing clear thoughts in simple and clear images. Pound tended to replace abstractions with concrete details. Ezra Pound founded Vorticism in 1914, influenced by Cubism. Poems written following this artistic trend had to avoid the use of traditional language. They had to celebrate energy, speed and dynamism. According to Pound, poetry should show the movement and the stillness inside the image. Beside Pound, T.S. Eliot has an essential role in developing modern poetry. His poem The Waste Land is considered the central modernist poem. Signature, public domain. In The Waste Land, Eliot introduces the use of myth and anthropology in poetry. Moreover, his poem is built around the idea of the failure of the Western civilization, being imbued as it is by images of sterility and chaos. Furthermore, the poem corresponds to the characteristics of modernism. For example, Eliot uses time shifts to reveal the use of the stream of consciousness technique. The extensive use of time shifts together with the use of the stream of consciousness technique generate a complete absence of narrative order. Many quotations from various authors are also inserted inside the text, in many different languages. Eliot hints at different philosophies and episodes from diverse religious traditions as well. The second-generation modernist poets is mainly represented by the Oxford poets, so called because they all were students from Oxford. They appeared around the 1930s. Unlike the first-generation modernist poets, the Oxford poets did not have a nihilistic vision and they did not use experimental techniques. They preferred writing in traditional forms and a less obscure language instead. Their poems were mainly concerned with social problems both in the UK and abroad. Their leader was Wystan Hugh Auden. His social and political commitment is expressed in the poem Refugee Blues. In 𝑴𝒐𝒅𝒏 he deals with the men's solitude in an indifferent world. The new Romanticism started thanks to the new apocalypse poets. They were a group of British poets, mostly born after the World War, who eventually elected D.H. Lawrence as their poetic forefather. They considered him the singer of the great elemental forces of nature as opposed to mechanical things. For them, Lawrence was also the writer who chose to regard emotion as superior to rationality. Dylan Thomas, a Welsh poet, followed this literary trend. He is best known for his sensual love for words and his fascination with nature and the world of childhood, like the metaphysical poets and the Romantics. Characteristics of modern poetry. 1. Modern poetry is written in simple language, the language of everyday speech, and even sometimes in dialect or jargon, like some poems of Rudyard Kipling, in the jargon of soldiers. 2. Modern poetry is mostly sophisticated as a result of the sophistication of the modern age, e.g., T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. 3. Alienation. The poet is alienated from the reader as a result of the alienation of the modern man. 4. Fragmentation. The modern poem is sometimes fragmented like a series of broken images, and again like The Waste Land. 5. Modern poetry is highly intellectual. It is written from the mind of the poet and it addresses the mind of the reader, like the poems of T.S. Eliot. 6. It is interested in the ugly side of life and in taboo subjects like drug addiction, crime, prostitution and some other subjects, like the poems of Allen Ginsberg. 7. Modern poetry is pessimistic as a result of the bad condition of man in many parts of the world, such as most of the poems of Thomas Hardy. 8. Modern poetry is suggestive. The poem may suggest different meanings to different readers. 9. Modern poetry is cosmopolitan. It appeals to man everywhere and at every time because it deals with the problems of man or humanity. 10. Experimentation is one of the important characteristic feature of modern poetry. Poets try to break new grounds, i.e., to find new forms, new language and new methods of expression. 11. It is irregular, written without meter and rhyme scheme and sometimes written in prose like the prose poem. 12. Interest in politics and the political problems of the age. 13. Interest in the psychology and in the subconscious. Many poets wrote unconsciously under the effect of wine or drugs. 14. Irregularity of form. Modern poetry is mostly written in free verse and prose, the prose poem. 15. Ambiguity. Most of the modern poetry is ambiguous for many reasons. 16. Interest in myth and especially Greek myth. 17. Interest in the problems of the average man and the lower classes of society. Now we are going to talk about the trends and the movements in modern poetry. Much that is traditional and Victorian still persists in modern poetry. 20th century poetry is a curious mixture of the traditional and the experimental. It is a curious mixture of the old and the new. It is complex and many-sided. Complexity, abundance of output, revolt against tradition, love of nature, pity for the poor and the suffering, disillusionment, loss of faith in religion, the metaphysical note, the romantic strain, the influence of music and other fine arts and new techniques are main trends of modern poetry. In the poetry of Thomas Stearns Eliot, we see several of these trends. In a sense, he has broken completely the bridge between Romanticism and Modernism. Moreover, he has influenced modern poetry to a great extent and main trends of modern poetry. The modern poetry is a poetry of revolt. It results largely from the impact of science. The poet turns away from the older Romantic tradition. The tradition still persists in Georgian poetry of the early years of the new century. The revolt is best exemplified in the poetry of T.S. Eliot. The poet sees life in its naked realism. Even the most prosaic and commonplace subjects are considered suitable. The heavy thud of bus, creaking of tramcars, the rattling noise of railway trains, the drone of an aeroplane, all these find their echo in modern poetry. The squalor and dinginess of an industrial civilization are reflected everywhere in the works of T.S. Eliot. After the Great War, poems appear in an ever-increasing number on the destructive means of warfare. The imagery and vocabulary of the modern poet reflects the influence of science and scientific inventions. Realism in subject matter has led the modern poet to reject the highly ornate and artificial poetic style of the Romantics in favor of a language which resembles closely the language of everyday life. The new poetry is realistic. The poet's consciousness of the grim realities of life has shattered all illusions and romantic dreams. The tragedy of everyday life has induced in the poet a mood of tense disillusionment. So the poetry today is bitter and pessimistic. The pessimism of the modern poet is very poignant and heart-rending. It is even sharper than the pessimism of Hardy, because it arises out of the contemplation of the stark realities of life. There is nothing sentimental about it. The Great War was a nerve-shattering experience. Man lost faith in accepted values. As a consequence, this note of bitterness is even more pronounced after the war. The Wasteland of Eliot reflects the tragic gloom and despair of the post-war world. As a result of science and the spirit of rationalism, the poet is skeptical about God. Hardy laughs ironically at him. Houseman does not hesitate to call him a brute or a blackguard. But this does not mean that religion is no longer a source of inspiration in poetry. In T.S. Eliot and Francis Thompson, we find a revival of Christian mysticism. The everlasting mercy of Mansfield has a religious theme. There are many fine devotional lyrics scattered all over his work. Even today there are mystical poets in the tradition of Blake and Wordsworth. Besides the influence of science, religion and mysticism, many other influences are at work on the modern poet. There has been a revival of interest in the poetry of Donne and the other metaphysical poets of the 17th century. Grierson's edition of Donne's poems was published in 1912. Ever since, English poetry has reflected more and more the intellectual qualities of Donne's poetry. Eliot has done much to bring about this metaphysical revival. Thus, we find in his poetry the same use of startling, far-fetched imagery, the same bringing together of opposites, the desire to startle and surprise. In this way, he is able to capture attention. Despite its stark realism in theme and treatment, there also runs a vein of romanticism in modern poetry. Much of Georgian and Edwardian poetry is in the Romantic strain. We find this strain of romance in the poetry of Walter de la Mare, John Masefield, and Yeats. In spite of all their earthliness, they have the romantic longing for a more perfect world. They would like to escape into a fairyland. Love is the dominant theme of the Romantics. It has not altogether died out in their poetry. Robert Bridges has left behind him some fine love lyrics. W.B. Yeats has been called the greatest love poet of the 20th century. Modern poetry has been influenced by the techniques of music, sculpture, painting and other arts. The modern poet freely uses the vocabulary and techniques of the other arts. However, it is music which has exercised the profoundest influence. The variations and repetitions in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland are like the movements of a symphony. As a result, L.A. Richards calls his poetry the music of ideas. Like a musician's phrases, his ideas are arranged. The technique of the cinematograph is also exploited by the poet of The Wasteland. The modern poet is constantly experimenting with new verse forms and poetic techniques. The use of slang and colloquialism has become common. The language and rhythm of poetry approximate more and more to those of common speech. The bonds of meter have been loosened. Rules of rhyme or meter are not followed. Stresses vary according to emotion. Verse rhythm is replaced by sense rhythm. The influence of modern psychologists, Freud, Jung and Bergson has become a commonplace. Emphasis has shifted from the externals to the rendering of the soul or psyche. However, Impressionism, Imagism and Surrealism are some other innovations in the 20th century. The Impressionists seek to convey the vague and fleeting sensations passing through their minds by the use of a novel imagery and metaphor. The Imagists are headed by Ezra Pound. They aim at clarity of expression through the use of hard, accurate and definite images to convey their ideas and emotions. The Surrealists try to express whatever passes in the subconscious, without any control or selection by the conscious. These innovations increase the complexity of modern poetry, and the bafflement of the reader. T.S. Eliot becomes an idol and the chief exponent of modernism in his poetry. He and modern poetry go hand in hand. His influence in this respect is undeniable. Throughout history, there have been hundreds of major and minor poetic movements and trends. The innovation and experimentations on the form and style of poetry in the modern period arouses wide attention of poets of different schools, and as a result, many poetical movements have emerged during the period. Some of the major movements that greatly shaped and influenced modern poetry are discussed as follows. Imagism. Imagism was a major modernist movement in poetry led by poets of both England and America in the early 20th century. This school of poetry flourished in England and America between 1912 and 1914. Ezra Pound, the founder of the school, later developed his idea into 3 Imagist poetic principles. Imagism emphasized the virtue of clarity, compression and precision of language. They used sharp language and embrace imagery. The movement reached its climax in 1914 when Pound published both in England and America the anthology of Imagist poetry entitled Des Imagists. The anthology contained poems by Pound, H. D. Richard Aldington, F. S. Flint, Amy Lowell, James Joyce, and William Carroll Williams. When Pound found Vorticism to be more appealing in 1914, Amy Lowell took over the leadership of the movement. The criteria of the School of Imagism: 1. Direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. 2. To use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. 3. As regarding rhythm, to compose in sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of the metronome. In setting these criteria for poetry, the Imagists saw themselves as looking backward to the best practices of pre-Romantic writing. Imagists poets used sharp language and embrace imagery. Their work, however, was to have a revolutionary impact on English language writing for the rest of the 20th century. Between 1914 and 1917, 4 anthologies of Imagist poetry were published. In addition to Pound, Flint, H.D. and Aldington, these included work by 𝒏𝒂𝒄𝒕𝒆𝒓𝒊𝒔𝒕𝒂𝒄𝒕𝒆𝒄 William Carlos Williams, James Joyce, Ford Madox Ford, Alan Upward, John Cornose, D. H. Lawrence and Marianne Moore. With a few exceptions, this represents a roll call of English-language modernist poets of the time. After the 1914 volume, Pound distanced himself from the group and the remaining anthologies appeared under the editorial control of Amy Lowell. Surrealism. Surrealism is one of the chief channels of 20th-century modernism. It is a modernist movement in the arts attempted to express the workings of the unconscious by fantastic imagery and incongruous juxtaposition of content. The movement grew out of Dadaism, was orchestrated by André Breton, the French poet and critic. Depending on its proponents, the movement drew on the troubled politics of the interwar years, the dream theories of Jung and Freud, studies of the occult and irrational. The Surrealists sought to represent the true process of thought and true reality. Though painting is the main arena for Surrealism to show its talent, it also included important poets and novelists. W. H. Auden, Dylan Thomas, Ted Hughes, Robert Bly, Allen Ginsberg, Robert Duncan etc. Symbolism. Symbolism is a major literary movement of the 19th century based in France. It is often associated with other labels: decadence, aestheticism, neo-romanticism, hermeticism, modernism and imagism. It is the usage of literary historians. Symbolism designates specifically a group of French writers, which included Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud, Paul Verlaine, Stéphane Mallarmé, and Paul Valéry. The French symbolists exploited an order of private symbols in poetry of rich suggestiveness rather than explicit signification. This technique had an immense influence throughout Europe and in England and America on poets like Arthur Symons, Ernest Towson, W. B. Yeats, Ezra Pound, Dylan Thomas, Hart Crane, Wallace Stevens etc. In the decades after World War I was a notable era of symbolism in literature. Many major modern poets exploit symbols, some of which are drawn from religious and esoteric traditions and some are invented. Symbolism was the poetry of disgusted and sometimes disillusioned idealists who sought in poetry an escape from the ugliness, hypocrisy and rapacity of the 19th century industrialized society. In contrast to the materialist, utilitarian and practical view of the world, symbolist poetry emphasized an ideal world beyond the material and sought an ideal languages to express that world. Objectivism. Objectivism is a term to designate a loose-knit group of second-generation modernists who emerged in 1930s mainly in America. The objectivists were highly influenced by Ezra Pound and William Carroll Williams. Objectivism is developed out of Imagism. The objectivist presents concrete objects not in order to convey abstract ideas but for the sake of their sensuous qualities. It reflects the poet's primary interest in composing a structure of relationships apprehensible as a whole, rather than in offering interpretations of experience. The objectivists also like to use language more literally than figuratively. They produced a considerable diversity of styles and were highly influential for later generations of writers working in the tradition of Modernist, etc. Please, do not forget to click notification bell, like, share, comment, and subscribe my channel.